Hey guys, June here, and in this video we're going to talk about Affinity, which is one of the most poorly understood concepts in combat, but is so highly influential that it's important that it's well understood and exploited whenever possible. Affinity, or what's sometimes called base hit chance, is a value that comes up in the hit chance calculation that weighs our accuracy against our opponent's defense to determine the probability that we'll hit the enemy with any kind of an ability or auto attack. Within this calculation, the affinity value is a number between 1 and 100 expressed in the form of a percentage. The easiest way to think about this is that the affinity percent is the portion of your accuracy that's actually being used in the calculation. So for example, on an enemy with 40 affinity, only 40% of your accuracy value is actually being equated towards your hit chance. When you think about it from this perspective, it's immediately clear how much of a dominating effect the affinity has on your hit chance against any enemy. The affinity value is tied to a monster's weaknesses, and in most cases a monster will have several different affinity values for different attack styles. As an example, an enemy that has a specific listed weakness to arrows will have an affinity value of 90 when under attack by arrows. When using a ranged style other than using arrows, they'll have an affinity value of 65. When using the attack style that they're neutral to, which in this case would be magic, they have an affinity value of 55, and when using the style that they're most resistant to, which in this case would be melee, they have an affinity value of 45. Most bosses don't follow these trends, however, and have a base affinity of 40 against all styles. In many cases, an enemy's defense is low enough that regardless of the attack style you choose, you have so much accuracy in comparison that you'll reach 100% hit chance without paying any special attention to affinity. In high-level encounters, however, affinity plays the dominant role in establishing your hit chance against the enemy and thus your overall average damage. So this brings us naturally to the question, who really cares? Obviously it's a little bit interesting to know how the calculations are done, but is there really anything we can do about it? And the answer is yes. It's possible to debuff the enemy's affinity, which is indicated by this broken shield icon on the enemy's debuff bar, through a few different means. Different varieties of this debuff can stack up to a total increase of 10 to affinity, however reapplying the same type of debuff only renews the timer on that debuff and does not cause it to stack. Just to take a generic example, that 40 affinity base that most bosses have, with the maximum debuff increased to 50 affinity, assuming that you don't have 100% hit chance against that enemy already, averages out to about a 25% increase to DPS for anyone attacking that same enemy. An average DPS bonus this strong is simply too large to ignore, especially in team encounters where multiple players will benefit from this effect. So now let's take a look at the actual debuffs that we can employ. The first is probably the most common and definitely the MVP, which is the Statius Warhammer Special attack. Although quite expensive to use, the Statius Warhammer Special attack bears the single largest debuff to affinity at +5. The special attack costs 35% of your adrenaline and lasts for 1 minute. Due to the high cost of using this debuff, which costs over 200k for each application based on current grand exchange prices, this is mostly limited to large team encounters, and in those circumstances where it's used, there's usually some kind of compensation given to the person who's using the Statius Warhammer. Another of the most common forms of affinity debuff are the Guthix Staff Special attack, which costs 25% of your adrenaline and boosts the enemy's affinity by 2, also lasting for 1 minute. Although quite a bit weaker than the +5 buff from the Statius Warhammer, this is effectively free to use and so should be employed anywhere that the affinity debuff is beneficial. Another very common form of affinity debuff comes from the Quake ability, which is a two-handed melee threshold ability that boosts the enemy's affinity by 2 for 1 minute. In a team encounter where you're trying to keep the maximal affinity debuff on the enemy at all times, likely the person who's using the Statius Warhammer debuff is also responsible for using the Quake debuff. It is, however, such an easy debuff to apply that there's no reason not to include this under any circumstances that you're using melee on an enemy where hit chance matters. Finally, the last affinity debuff you're ever likely to actually employ in PvM actually comes from a pocket slot item. This comes from the active effect of the Bandos godbook, the Book of War. Both the conventional and illuminated versions work, and they increase the enemy's affinity by 3 for 12 seconds. Because the book has a cooldown, it's impossible to have 100% uptime on the debuff, however it makes a considerable enough difference that it's worth having at least one person on your team using it, likely the base tank strategically so that other players can use stronger pocket slot damage boosting items. These 4 types of debuffs are the only types of affinity debuffs you should ever use, and between them you can always keep the enemy at 9 or 10 stacks and effectively get the maximum use out of it. There are 3 other affinity debuffs as well, the Barrel Chest Anchor Special attack, the Bone Dagger Special attack, and the Dragon Hatchet Special attack. These debuffs, however, are either too unpredictable to be reliably used or cost too much adrenaline to be worth using. Hopefully this video helped clear up your understanding of affinity, and I would encourage you all to try this out at some bosses where you conventionally miss a lot and see how much of a difference it can make in your DPS. Apologies for the infrequency of videos recently, but I am in the middle of a divorce and life has been pretty complicated, but I am trying really hard to get more content out there for you guys. Thanks to all of you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.